Welcome back to another We Got Your Mac. My name is Scott Smith. This episode is brought to you by Jamf. So security is a topic that has come up multiple times throughout this season, whether it was the main topic of conversation or just a byproduct of whatever else we were talking about. Security is usually top of mind, as it should be. So each year, Jamf puts out a report called the Security 360 Annual Trends Report. And it's filled with analysis on the current state of security and risks that are out there and even how malware has evolved. Just a ton of really great information for organizations to be aware of. So we wanted to get some insights on this report and its findings directly from Jamf. And so Victoria and I had a really great conversation. So let's go ahead and get right into it.
So we're here today with Michael Covington, who is Vice President of Portfolio Strategy at Jamf. Welcome, Michael. And can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and give us a little bit of background on Jamf as well?
Sure thing. And thanks for having me. So I've been in the security industry for way too long. I did my doctoral dissertation in information security and worked at a number of large companies, and now am leading portfolio strategy at Jamf, where our focus is really on helping organizations succeed with Apple. And so nowadays, given all the critical applications that are running on Apple devices and within the Apple ecosystem, security is paramount. And so what we're really finding a lot of our customers are talking about, what's really front of mind for them is how do they make sure that their devices are secure and that they can operate their businesses effectively, while also making sure that they protect the privacy of their users that are utilizing these tools. So lots of things for us to dig into and talk about there today, I hope.
Jamf is obviously probably one of the most well-known Apple device management tools. I think what maybe isn't as well known is this annual report that you all put out called the Jamf Security 360 report. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk to you about today. Can you just kind of give us an overview of like what this report is, kind of what you guys look at and sort of the value that it brings?
Sure thing. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of the security products that Jamf has. But what a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of is the whole team that stands behind those products that really make sure that they are effective and that they're adequate to meet the evolving threat landscape that a lot of our customers are facing every day. And so we have a dedicated threat research team. They are actively looking for new attacks, new pieces of malware, new techniques that the attackers are utilizing. And then they're taking those learnings and they're putting them back into the product to make sure that it really keeps up with what the attackers are doing with their methods. So what we do every year is we take a look back. So we take about 12 months of real world data and we try to really aggregate it, analyze it, and try to give some perspective on what it is that we've seen over the previous year and forecast in a way what we expect a lot of our customers and organizations that are using Apple at work to struggle with as it relates to the threat landscape in the year ahead. And so we published our Security 360 report back in Q1. And I have to say, I think it continues to be just a treasure trove of information for organizations to look at and almost benchmark themselves against how other organizations similar to them might be doing and what some of the toolings that they should be considering might be as they look to really harden their fleets and really embrace Apple at work more than perhaps they're already doing.
So I know there's a huge amount of information in there, and so this is not necessarily going to be the easiest question for you to ask, but what are some of the key findings within that report?
You know, if I can use an analogy, the analogy that I like to use for this particular year's Security 360 report, it's that of an army that's amassing on the border. They're not infiltrating yet. They haven't necessarily captured any cities, but they are there and they are breathing over the citizens, and they very much have a presence. And so what we've seen is that it's not as bad as many organizations might think it is. There's a lot of talk, for example, about ransomware that has really had a significant impact on businesses across a number of different industries. We haven't seen that in the Apple environment. And so there's some positive news that's in the report, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that I think give us some concern. So maybe just to give it a little bit of structure, I think some of the things that we've seen really start with device hygiene. how are Apple devices being configured and managed at work? And I'm sorry to say that hygiene is just abysmal with a lot of our customers.
I don't think that's new, is it? Or necessarily entirely unique to the management of Apple devices.
Yeah, absolutely not. I think there's a reason for that. Most of the guidelines that have been provided to organizations were written for other operating systems. And when you try to force fit those configurations or those recommendations onto an Apple device, it just doesn't work. You need a different set of tools, a different set of configurations to make sure that those devices are kind of hardened and appropriately ready for work. One of the things that we found in our report, just looking at our worldwide customer base, 39% of organizations are operating a device with known vulnerabilities. In fact, 40% of all mobile devices being used at work are operating with critical or high vulnerabilities, which is really alarming if you can consider where these mobile devices are being utilized. They're being utilized in hospitals, at patient bedsides. They're being utilized in commercial aircraft, where it might be flight attendants, it might be pilots with these devices.
I'm not getting on a plane ever again now, Michael. But I know the numbers are shocking, but are they really surprising, given the length of time you've been in the industry?
They're not. And I think what concerns me the most is that there is a perception gap here. There's a belief that a lot of these devices are secure at the moment they come out of shrink wrap, and they stay that way for the entire time they're in circulation. That's where there's a disconnect with a lot of our organizations using these devices.
We did talk to Brad Bowers about that back in season 1, about this kind of myth that Apple somehow is less risky because nobody's paying attention to attacking it, or and there's the ecosystem system. And while there are some differences, the end of the day, the attackers are going to go where the opportunity is, and as Apple grows its market share, it becomes more attractive, doesn't it?
It sure does. One of the things that's been really interesting to me over the last, I'd say, 12 to 18 months is the broader set of applications that are being utilized on these devices. I think we used to see a lot of these Apple devices, particularly the mobiles, really just being utilized for personal information management. You'd had your email, your contacts, your calendar, maybe that was it. Now it's just about every critical work application that you need to be productive. You can almost do your entire job, no matter what your role is, on a mobile device. In fact, we see a lot of organizations giving users iPads and iPhones as the primary compute device, which is great from a usability perspective. But when you consider some of the reality checks we have here in terms of how the devices are configured, whether or not they're meeting compliance standards, it's concerning. And I think that's where businesses maybe need a little bit of a wake-up call.
Just to confirm, you're talking about mobile devices. This is not just iOS, right? You also looked at the Android side?
Absolutely. Yes, we did look across the board at mobile devices, both operating systems that were utilized by our customer base.
And although obviously you're looking at the corporate world, businesses, government organizations, etc., I guess the same applies to us from a personal perspective. You need to keep up to date. The manufacturers of these operating systems, of these applications, are pushing out updates to help keep us safe. And we really should be paying attention to the fact that our devices are telling us that we need to update. Obviously, in a corporate environment, those are being pushed onto you. And sometimes some of us get those warnings of, if you do not install this, you will be disconnected. I think people assume that maybe their employers may be overly risk averse and that they don't need to apply the same level of rigor to their personal devices. But I think one of the lessons we can learn is, if our employers are worried about it, we should be as individuals as well.
Absolutely. And I think it goes not to protecting just work data, but personal information as well. These devices are full of very rich sensing capabilities, from location tracking to health data collection. And a lot of that information can do you harm if it falls into the wrong hands. And I think, to your point around updating these devices, I think one of the things that we need to remind businesses and individuals of is that this is a layered problem. The stats that I gave you, around 40% of all mobile devices running a vulnerable OS, that's just the operating system layer.
Yeah.
We also have to start thinking about the applications that people are putting on there. Those applications are gateways now for attackers to get into the device because of the vulnerabilities that the applications themselves are introducing. And we also have to now consider the fact that not all of these applications are going through a curation process. So as we start to see more alternative app marketplaces come on board, there's some new content that could make its way to users and within organizations that I think could do some additional harm that had not previously been considered when you had just the app store that was distributing the apps that were running on these devices. One of the things that we saw, and this was, keep in mind, looking at 2023, before you had some of the mandates that came across that was forcing Apple and some of these other organizations to open up their app distribution mechanisms, we saw 8% of organizations had a mobile device that was accessing a third-party app store. And we also saw that 2.5% of devices had vulnerable applications that were installed over the course of the year. So it seems like a low number, but when you consider that's almost 3 out of 100 devices, that's a pretty significant footprint within an organization that could be exposed to some threat.
Yeah, and I guess it's not even just applications. I mean, obviously that's a new thing on the Apple side of the house. You know, Android has always been able to download apps from various app stores. But it seems like there are even other ways of getting malware on your device outside of installing applications, and things that have even kind of surprised me, like an iMessage that has a link in it. What kind of stuff do you see around that?
Yeah, so I think as we start to talk about links, it's probably worth noting just at the start here that users are usually the weakest link in the chain. So it's really easy for us to talk about how organizations aren't keeping their devices up to date and the applications might be running with some vulnerabilities. But we saw 9% of users across the board in all industries fell victim to phishing attacks in the 12 months that preceded our report. And what was more interesting is that phishing attacks were 50% more successful on mobile than they were on a desktop or a laptop device. And so users are oftentimes the ones that are letting these threats in. And we oftentimes talk about phishing because I think a lot of individuals can relate to it. You understand what it means to give up your password or some personal information that you might have on yourself. But it also is a way for the users to be tricked into clicking links, into downloading some additional things to the device that could ultimately expose that device for further exploit. And so we actually have seen a lot of these threats make their way into the device via the user or via the attackers that are exploiting some of these WebKit vulnerabilities. So sending a vulnerable link that the device might, because of a vulnerability, automatically execute without the user having to even tap on anything. So a lot of different kind of vectors there to consider, but it usually is something additional coming into the device from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to come up. It's come up in every conversation we've had about security, is that ultimately it's the user that is the vulnerability, because we can do quite a lot with the technology. The technology is, relatively speaking, predictable, but unfortunately our end users, I was going to say our end users aren't particularly predictable. In some ways they are, but we don't have the same ability to control them to quite the same level of rigor as perhaps we do the devices. So yeah, comes up time and time again that the users are the place that we really need to focus from a security and a compliance perspective.
A big part of it is education. I think that's the thing that we've heard in the security industry now for so long, is that users need to be educated to spot the latest form of the attack and not fall victim. The thing that I think needs to change in the industry is we need to stop the shaming. We need to stop blaming the users for falling victim to some of these links that they accidentally click on. They're really compelling. The attacks have really evolved and they've become very personal. They've become targeted. And it's no surprise that users are clicking on some of these things. And so I think what we need to do is we need to get users talking more, explaining what it was that made them fall victim to some of these attacks, share it with their peers so that others don't fall victim. And that actually, I think that's how we start to build some better defenses into these organizations.
Yeah, and it seems too like, obviously there is no such thing as perfect security. I mean, an organization can do everything that they can. At the end of the day, people may still just do what they're going to do. So the focus almost needs to be more on resilience and being able to bounce back from an attack rather than specifically focusing on trying to prevent every attack, because that's just impossible. But as far as trying to mitigate those risks, configuration management, things like that, like what are some best practices that you would offer to organizations looking to secure themselves?
I think first and foremost, think about those timely software updates. Make sure that the operating systems, the applications that you're running are updated within a very tight window of being available. I know a lot of organizations want to do testing to make sure that their applications continue to work when updates come along. That's fine. You can do testing in small groups and slow roll out an update. You just need to have a process in place that's documented and that you stick to. So I think that's one of the key things. Keeping in mind that a lot of those threats come in via the users, I think it's really important that we think about how we harden the device against the user making mistakes. So really thinking through, how do we prevent those phishing attacks? How do we do it in a way that's privacy preserving, so that we can prevent phishing, not just on a corporate Mac, for example, but on a personal iPhone or a shared iPad. There are technologies that are out there that we utilize in our own technology stack that allow us to prevent not just phishing attacks, but all those malicious things that come across the network. One of the things that we published in our report was that 11% of devices were connected to malicious network traffic. Malicious network traffic is kind of a catch-all bucket, if you will, for command and control and data exfiltration and all those nasty things that malware is known to take advantage of at the network layer. Having policies on the device that are tied to your device configuration and management process is really important. Don't disconnect management security and kind of keep those as separate teams, but instead put a thoughtful set of policies on the device when you're configuring them and making them ready for work. Because Scott, back to your point, it's about resiliency. It's about making sure that these devices can stay running and that you can recover when something goes wrong. And you can only do that if you can detect and respond kind of all in the same window, if you will.
Break away from traditional device management. No more waiting on device check-in and heavy network burden. It's time to embrace secure cloud-first scalability, autonomous workflows, and responsive device inventory. Strategize with the next evolution of management and security. That's modern management, possible with Jamf.
I think the point you make about management is really important, because security, as you say, it doesn't sit in isolation. And historically, we've seen a lot of people just having small pockets of Macs or iOS devices and thinking of them as specialized devices and not necessarily managing them as effectively or even managing them at all. But we know that most organizations use a mix of Apple and non-Apple devices. And we have data from our own End User Compute Summit, which clearly indicated that almost everybody was using a mixture of operating systems. And the minority operating system, the minority devices still need to be managed effectively. The technologies are out there to allow it to happen. There are very few devices out there that can't be managed. And I know Apple Vision Pro, for example, can now be managed through MDM. And I believe Jamf has that capability. So, if it's a corporate device, we manage it. And that is going to help prevent some of this. It's not just about the security.
Yeah, correct. And I think of effective security as really being implemented across a number of different layers. Layers of defense is the kind of age-old expression in the security industry, and management for me is the base layer. It's how you pull the device into the fold, and you kind of establish a relationship with that device, and you assess what changes it might need to kind of be secure and compliant with the organization's requirements. And a lot of times we talk about management as though it's a company or organization specific thing. You need to decide what your policies are on your own. And that's nonsense. There's, I think, a lot of online forums and communities that allow peer exchange of information on how devices should be configured or could be configured. But there's also the compliance standards. We've got the CIS benchmarks, for example, or NIST 800 that allow us to really get a good understanding on what best practice looks like. And then you can make those minor tweaks that are distinct for your organization. So compliance is almost an additional layer for me that I think a lot of organizations might look to and say, that's just for those that are governed by regulatory bodies. But no, those are best practices for a reason. And they're great standards for us to look to just for guidance on how we should get started. And then you can fine tune to make sure that it works for your organization and your users, and that people can continue to be productive even while you're aligning to some of these compliance standards.
So I come from an asset management background. That's where I started in technology. So I'd say it starts before management. It starts with actually knowing what you've got out there so that you know that everything is actually being managed. Having worked in that environment, quite horrifying, actually, the lack of knowledge some organizations have about the devices that are within their organization, and sometimes a perception that, if there is no financial value attached to something, then you don't need to worry about managing it as an asset. But if you're not managing it as a financial asset, you should still manage it as a productive corporate asset, because it needs to get into all of these other management processes, security processes, and not just fall off the list because it has no residual value from an accounting perspective anymore. It has a risk value attached, or liability attached to it if it doesn't have a value, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And if you'll allow me to just veer off topic for just a moment, one of the capabilities that we have in our stack is zero trust network access capability. It allows you to get kind of modern remote access from a device out to an application that sits in the cloud, maybe on-prem, behind a firewall. It's remote. And one of the things that we have found from our customers, big and small, is that they don't even know the applications their devices are attaching to. They don't have an inventory of the remote applications that people are touching, let alone the devices that are accessing those applications. And what we're able to do with our stack is A, bring up that inventory so that you can actually see what people are attaching to, but then bring in that risk signal. And this is something that I think, if you're looking at a maturity curve, we as an industry are very much at the starting early days of this, where people aren't taking what they know about the device and connecting the dots to the access that's happening with the applications. We need more businesses to be thinking about, how risky is the device? Do I know the device? And am I comfortable with that device and what I know about it in allowing it to access some of my most critical intellectual property? I think this is where the industry has a lot of ground to make up here in bringing together these different silos that we've operated for decades now.
Yeah, I remember a conversation when I was back at Gartner with the security team. We were talking about identity and access management and the need to actually consider the device from the IAM perspective as well as the user, because there was all of this, having just said that the users are probably the biggest problem, there was all of this focus on authenticating the user and not necessarily thinking about, is it a known device? So there is talk about devices being people too when you're looking at your security practices. But your point about those SaaS applications doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I've talked to clients in the past and they've said, oh no, we only use half a dozen SaaS applications. And you've been able to come back and go, no, actually, here is the number of SaaS applications you have. And they're horrified that they're unaware of them. Actually, they are known about somewhere in the organization, but nobody's bringing the whole thing together with the full picture. So I guess this is where, third-party risk management, understanding of the supply chain then comes in. I mean, it just gets bigger and bigger the more you think about it, really, doesn't it? Because it starts with your device and your user, but those are connected to the big wide world, and everything you connect to is connected to something else. So that perfect security that Scott was talking about, definitely unachievable. It is about being a little bit pragmatic and thinking about the resilience and the recovery and accepting that you're not going to be able to know everything.
And being able to pivot rather quickly in real time as threats are being encountered. And so again, this is where we start to see really that kind of coming together of some of the traditional management capabilities, some of the core security detection capabilities, that we're now in a world where when you detect something going sideways on an endpoint, you can actually deploy capabilities to that endpoint and have it gather forensics information so that you can, once the incident has passed, look back, see what happened, see how the attacker navigated within that device and perhaps pivoted off of it, and use that to not only get the user back up and running, but to improve your overall defenses down the road. So I think that we're in a better place than we were 5 years ago, but the industry has a lot of work to do, I think, to continue moving in a direction where we're bringing all this information that we have into more centrally informed decision points.
So no sitting back and relaxing for the security community anytime soon then?
Sadly not. If I just look at the report that we put out this year, there were 300 families of macOS malware that we were tracking. And the thing that I think surprised me the most is that, 2-3 years ago, it used to be adware. And this year, we saw Trojans make up 18% of that macOS malware stack. And we also started to see real examples of viable ransomware starting to kind of, I think, creep on the horizon for the Mac community. So no rest for this group. I think that there's a lot of work to do to continue to keep up with what we're seeing kind of mounting there on the border. But as long as we can keep businesses moving forward with better hygiene, compliance, good configurations to keep their user risk managed, I think that's where we're going to start to see that hardened base pay dividends when it comes time.
So, Michael, thank you so much. That was a lot of really, really great insight. We're going to make the Security 360 report available on wegotyourmac.com for anybody that's interested in downloading it. So, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So that was some really great insight from Michael, and some pretty startling statistics when you really think about it. Just to call out a couple of them, he mentioned 39% of organizations are operating devices with known vulnerabilities. And then 40% of all mobile devices being used for work are operating with critical or high vulnerabilities. And he called out some, pretty high stakes positions like in hospitals and commercial aircraft that are using these devices. That this is definitely something for people to think about and just try to get ahead of. Another thing that I wanted to call out is the third-party app store conversation. The fact that 8% of organizations have mobile devices that access a third-party app store. 8% doesn't sound like that much, but when you really put it in perspective of the entire sample, that's a lot. And then the fact that 2.5% of devices had vulnerable applications that were installed over the course of the year. Now, again, 2.5, that doesn't sound like that much, but when you think about the number of devices, that's fairly alarming. And definitely from the Apple perspective, this is something for people to think about in the EU, since Apple has essentially been forced to open iOS and iPadOS to third-party app stores. It's not even just a matter of people installing applications. I think enough Apple users are going to stick to what they're used to. If you want to install an app on your iPhone, you're going to go to Apple's App Store, regardless of what else is available. To me, it just seems like another attack vector. And I don't know the security that will be around this, but this is how malware spreads anyways. People, bad actors send links to users who don't necessarily know what they are. They click on them. It installs some sort of malware on their device. I just feel like this is definitely something that people need to be aware of in the EU when people are able to install applications from anywhere on an iPhone. Just more things for organizations to think about. And then the bit about phishing as well. And this is another theme that has come up multiple times throughout this season, is that the weakest point in any organization's security is the user. And, the fact that 9% of users across all industries fell victim to phishing attacks in that year before the report is alarming, and, just calls for greater training and awareness of what phishing can look like and telling people not to just click on links and give away information. So that'll do it for this episode. We'd like to thank Michael again and Jamf for their support of this episode. If you're interested in checking out the Security 360 report, we have it available to download on wegotyourmac.com, as well as the corresponding blog post for this episode with some extra information in there. Thank you so much for listening and or watching, and we'll see you in the next one.